Now, I'm not making this video at the most advantageous time. Seeing how we have how many days until this election? Oh. So, I suppose I should start by first saying, if you plan on voting for Donald Trump, I ask you to please exit this video and find someone else to harass. I mean, don't you and your friends got a Biden bus to harass or traffic to block with your voter intimidation? Now, for the rest of you, at this point, I think many of you have already made up your mind on either voting for Joe Biden or not. I don't expect many undecided voters remaining, as the lines have clearly been drawn at this point. But if you're a leftist and you have not yet voted and you ultimately decide to do so, you're going to have to do it in person at this time. Probably wait in wild lines in the middle of a pandemic where cases of COVID are setting record numbers every day. No pressure, right? So this is more or less my final thoughts on this debate on voting, but let's say you are the undecided voter that may have decided to risk all those dangers tomorrow. I want to keep your attention by first explaining the merits of voting. When you ask someone why they vote, they obviously will answer in different ways depending on how they view the purpose. For some, voting is in many ways viewed as a form of expression. You go to the polls, you vote for the candidate that you like the best, and then you go home. There you see, I participated. I made my voice heard. That, I believe, is the view many people hold in regards to voting. A sort of artistic expression almost. Now, finding a candidate who embraces your values is understandable, but how many of you can tell me that has been the case for you specifically in all previous elections? How many of you felt disappointed by who is available to vote for? Maybe that's kept you from choosing between the main Democrat or Republican candidate and made you vote third party instead. Or it's kept you home and made you decide not to vote at all. Now, I can understand the disappointment and frustration in picking candidates you don't always agree with, but fervent idealism that either makes you decide to support a certain candidate or keeps you at home and not vote at all while ignoring all practical consequences of those two decisions is kind of foolhardy. The purpose of voting is not to express your fidelity to some worldview you hold, and it's not really to wave a flag of your principles, although that seems to be appealing for most people. It's really to produce outcomes. That is the most effective form of voting. As Mitch McConnell would say,
in order for the president's agenda to advance, we have to be able to elect people who support the agenda. But I think most Republicans want to see us win elections, because I always remind people that the winners of elections make policy and the losers go home and go into some other line of work.
Now that turtle has a point, and it may be a hard pill for many to swallow, but there seems to be a naive view going around this discourse that suggests if one side loses the election, it's just, well, let's go back to the drawing board, I suppose. Better luck next year. Now, that of course ignores the consequences when certain people gain power, like when Republicans swept local and state governments in 2010 and 2014, which allowed them to pass voter suppression laws and gerrymander a congressional district to benefit their own supporters at the expense of anyone who wasn't a Republican. Or you can look at the consequences of allowing Donald Trump a second term as president, which is pretty frightening indeed. So obviously that may put people on edge, but I don't want this to be a vote-shaming video. I'm explaining to you the reality of the situation that we face this election. Take it for what you wish. And coming to terms with that reality is first accepting the fact that only one of two people have the best likelihood of becoming the next president. Do I really have to spell it out to you? Who they are? I mean, I think we all know who. That may very well be compromising to some of you, but if voting for a third-party candidate or staying home means that you're just going to lose the election in the end, then you really haven't done a service to anyone but yourself. Even then, it can be hard to argue if you even did yourself a favor besides some self-serving feel-good act. It's important for voters to balance their principles with the consequences of their actions. Again, I'm not trying to be a vote shamer here, and I'll try and flesh out all sides as best as I can with the limited time I have left. Ugh. So let's just cut to the chase. Now, utilitarianism suggests that the best action is whichever creates the maximum happiness for the greatest number of people, such as voting with an eye to the political consequences. That is to say, getting people in power that you feel the most comfortable with to you and your fellow buddies, as opposed to allowing someone else to gain power that would be a detriment to you and your buddies. On the opposite side, the deontological approach argues that the action itself, rather than the consequences, has moral worth, and so it would be acceptable to say, vote Howie Hawkins or Joe Jorgensen, or don't vote at all, because fuck them. Now, obviously, I lean more to the utilitarian approach. Sorry, everybody. And when I vote, I'm not just thinking about what's in it for me personally, but also how I can help the most people. I think staying home and allowing Trump to win or not voting for his opponent who has the best likelihood at beating him puts a lot of people at risk. That includes the immigrant community, the LGBTQ community, and quite frankly, anybody who wants healthcare, just to name a few. What can get lost in this approach, however, is nuance. Opting for the more practical candidate usually means settling for something closer to the status quo that leaves limited opportunities for perspectives that fall outside party lines. And this can get pretty frustrating. And in the long term, that can be counterproductive. This is what many of my opponents to my approach would tell you. But again, just by playing that turtle,
The winners of elections make policy, and the losers go home and go into some other line of work.
nothing also gets done in the long term when you don't operate levers of power. And abstaining from voting does not absolve you from the consequences should more unlikable people take power. And I would also like to add, and this may sound a bit cliche, that this isn't a normal election. I know. Again, your skepticism to that is understandable if you see the long-term consequences of voting for the lesser of two evils. So look, I feel there are some sound reasons why people are not voting for Joe Biden or why they're not voting at all. There's an interesting debate that Virgil Hexas and Brianna Joygray had with Noam Chomsky on whether or not people on the left should vote for Joe Biden. I'd recommend everyone watch it, because it shows that this dynamic of choice is far more complicated than many people want to give it credit for. And it shows why there are many legitimate reasons and concerns why some people have just decided to sit out this election. But to my fellow leftists, the argument between pro and anti-Biden boils down to, 1, Biden may give the left more time to organize, but will lose liberal supporters, aka back to brunch people. 2, Trump will give the left far more supporters, but reduce our time to organize. But the adverse can also be true. Biden may give the left more time to organize in order to gain more liberal supporters. Meanwhile, at the same time, Trump can give the left far less support and apparatus to work effectively, since it takes a lot of faith to assume everyone will be drawn to socialism the further capitalism deteriorates. Remember that Trump is a symptom, not a cause of the issues this country is facing. And this is my personal view, but I believe him and his supporters are setting the country up to be an oligarchical structure that benefits Trump, his successors, and all the people that support them. That's what I believe is at stake in the long term here. Short term, however, you're going to see further deterioration of your life in this late stage capitalist system. Just you wait. Now look, I'll be honest with you. I'm not one of the people who thinks that Joe Biden can be bullied to the left. I think that the argument for voting for Joe Biden shouldn't be that we can push him left, but rather that his cabinet of corporate Democrats will have a survival instinct. You see, the neoliberal Democrats' relationship to the economy is that it needs to be saved by intervention. Republicans, on the other hand, are more dogmatic and think that the market is magic. So in their cynical ploys, they just gut public funding and let things collapse, paving the way for privatization and, unbeknownst to them, the further consolidation of oligarchy and further exacerbation of the material conditions we live under. The reality is that capitalism, as we know it, the entire presentation of supply and demand, is more or less dead or dying. It's an unsustainable system. You can simply look at the damage that we are doing to the environment, as well as our response to COVID, as further proof. Things are not looking good for us people. What we have is a choice between some neo-feudalistic fascism and a technocracy that is willing to make changes only for its own preservation as an institution. Again, not ideal, but still. Ultimately, the small cumulative changes offered by neoliberals are not sufficient for thriving and sustainability, but ultimately preserve some vestige of civilization. To simplify, if you want to do something to the effect of seizing the means of production, we need to ensure those means are completely gutted by a hostile reactionary party. Democrats, under Joe Biden, at least offer some form of preservation of that for us to work with. It's also important to have an apparatus present that will ensure further cultivation of leftist movements to grow without the threat of them being snubbed out or even openly attacked, both passive as well as raw acts of power. I, personally, am voting for Joe Biden. Now, it's not my business or responsibility for what you do. It's not my life, and me telling you how to vote reflects my interest, not necessarily yours. Again, if voting is really your choice, you should make it. So now let's talk about reform and revolution. This is a hard turn we're going to make here. Some leftists argue that voting is just bourgeois illusions of change, that it doesn't actually solve anything. Many on the left think that instead of voting, we should focus on more direct action, even to the point of armed resistance. To which I ask, you really think we're ready for that? I've lost count on how many right-wing paramilitary groups exist in this country that jack off to the very idea of civil war and shooting leftists. Meanwhile, the number of armed leftist groups are less than the number of fingers on one of my hands, let alone the number of active members these groups actually hold to combat the right. Now, to further clarify, let me just say that Kyle Rittenhouse traveled to Kenosha, Wisconsin with his AR rifle because he knew the majority of people protesting were not armed. And there was a very small chance he feared being shot. He understood that it could have been open season if he and the people like him decided not to hold back their trigger fingers so cautiously. Those on the right seem pretty confident in their efforts to overpowering any left-wing opposition at this moment. And that's a serious problem. That needs to change. The left needs to organize more. More importantly, they need to be armed more. In my opinion, voting for Biden gives us that time to prepare, at least some time to be more ready, at least to serve as an effective counterweight to armed right-wing opposition. It also gives us time to organize more politically in order to be more effective in outreach and recruitment. These are real goals. We are essentially Biden for time. But look, if you don't believe that the harm from capitalism can be mitigated by policy without murdering a whole bunch of people, then it sounds like you don't have enough support for getting rid of capitalism to successfully revolt anyway. This is the distinction 100%. It's pretty inevitable that there will be a point at which the ruling class's only remaining option is violence, at which point it will become necessary to fight back. I don't yearn for it, but I am pragmatic about the likelihood. Now, I love to see people intentionally misreading what I say as violence is unnecessary for revolution, which is not what I'm saying at all. Violence will be necessary, tragically, but it shouldn't be enjoyable, and the goal should be to reduce as much violence as possible. Yearning for the revolution itself can be dangerously blinding and intoxicating, and I see this a lot on Twitter. Plus, I don't know why you have to have this position that voting and direct action are two mutually distinct choices, when in reality, we can do both. It's the most beneficial way to progress change that doesn't involve an outright civil conflict. We can look to what happened in Bolivia as a prime example of this. In November 2019, Socialist President Evo Morales was ousted from power by a coup backed by the United States. A fascist minority party was installed in order to undo the socialist progress made and make the country safe for more exploitative resource extraction for first world markets. It took a year of protests, demonstrations, and other direct actions, culminating in an election which resulted in a landslide victory for the socialists to win back power. It just goes to show that one should use all options available in order to achieve the best outcomes. Marxism is a guide to action, not an inflexible dogma. Now, it's okay to yearn for the next world, but do everything to build it. Don't just focus on how to destroy the current one. That's why we need to work with all options available for us. It's why there is benefit to voting. You know, with everything going on this election, it seems like waiting for the results on November 3rd is like being in the final scene of Fight Club. The atmosphere is tense. We're all in a state of shock as the events are unraveling before us. All we can do is just observe patiently, if not stressfully, for the outcome. What is that outcome, though? The future seems either uncertain to some and quite frankly terrifying to others. It all looks rather bleak. I wish I had more uplifting rhetoric to inspire you to wish for a better future, but at this point the only future we can get is the one we actively fight for. Everyone seems to have a particular way of fighting that fight, whether that be through voting, not voting, direct action, staying at home, hunkering down. And I hope that I've at least highlighted why some have considered one option while others have opted for alternatives. I hope everyone tries them all and does not toss them so hastily in the name of ideological purity. In conclusion, November 3rd doesn't mean that this is all over. In fact, this is only the beginning. For many, it's just a continuation of things that have already been transpiring. Regardless if you voted for Joe Biden or not, we must remember that we're all still in this together. Okay, yeah, sorry, I had to cut the music because I didn't want to get a copyright strike. But thank you all for watching. This is my first solo video, and I was a bit apprehensive of doing it. Sorry if I came off as nervous. And I wish I wasn't doing it in such ominous times. But I love you all. Be safe. And hopefully you'll see more videos from me in the future.